Is everyone ready? I think you're unmuted, Ale. Yeah, let's make sure. Three, two, three, two, one. Firstly, a quick model. We are only going to do this in instances where these violations are systemic. So we are happy to look at UNHRC and Amnesty International lists where these countries appear year on year to the instant that is true. Secondly, we're also happy to defend allowing these MNCs back in the countries if they start improving. So if there are active violations of human rights that the government is now cracking down upon, to the extent that you are improving these conditions and passing policies that allow you to leverage and improve the conditions there, we're okay with allowing them back in. Finally, we would also just note that we're happy to give them a certain time period before we start banning MNCs. So we're okay with conditionalizing this, like if you don't improve X metric within a year, then we are going to ban you, not going to do it immediately. We think that's a perfectly reasonable interpretation. How is this going to be enforced? Two specific ways. First, we would note that this enforcement is going to be happening on a broader scale. So for example, we're okay with Norway holding its own MNCs liable. To the extent that that is true, Western countries will be holding these MNCs liable and not allowing them into these kinds of countries. There are two specific metrics on which we think these are enforced. First, we're okay with doing lawsuits and having fines for singular violations. We're also happy to take a stronger stance, that is literally ban them from the market, happy to take stronger actions like banning the CEOs, not giving them licenses if they continue to operate within these areas in the first place. I'll pause time for the model questions. Good. Okay, cool. That's 116, 3, 2, 1. The first thing I want to prove then is how these countries benefit from MNCs in a few specific ways, and why they're incredibly important to the local economy. Firstly, we would posit that these MNCs often bring in large amounts of capital and inject them into things like abusive regimes. So this literally looks like billions of dollars from Microsoft. It looks like Western Energy in Myanmar, literally giving the junta legitimacy and money in order to continue perpetuating their harms onto the average person. Notably, this just does mean that the junta or existing regimes get significant amounts of taxes and capital from these areas, which allow them to continue functioning and having significant amount of change inside of the house. Secondly, obviously it allows for legitimacy to international observers and people. To the extent that investors exist abroad, they obviously have incentives to give more money to MNCs, and it also gives a degree of legitimacy and a very layer of legitimacy to the government itself at the point where international observers and investors are operating within these areas. Finally, we would often just note that these MNCs often fund the government indirectly through other means. So this looks like corruption with governments, where they're often given bribes, where they're often given political lobbying, etc. And so these MNCs often provide a large amount of leverage within these individual operations. Given this, the real question is, why does these MNCs leaving actually trigger change on our side of the house? There are three specific mechanisms that I want to explain under this. Firstly, we would just note that money is an incredibly important economic tool that is likely to happen. I want to just be extremely explicit here. Look, more than just the general power within an autocratic regime, people tend to care about their wealth, especially the higher ups. Notably, MNCs are major funders of these people. They often provide large amounts of taxation so that the average rich government gets a lot of money in order to implement its abuse. It's also the case that rich autocrats often get their money through taxation, which is skimp off the top. So to the extent that that is true, these autocrats often enjoy large amounts of money and personal wealth through the implementation of taxation and through the implementation of taking large amounts of from these places. At the point where MNCs are no longer allowed to operate within these areas, we would say their personal fortunes are reduced. Notably, these are significantly more important than just maintaining power, because I think most autocrats care significantly more about sending their kids to a private Swedish school. They care a lot about their private jet, and they care a lot about their luxurious lifestyles more than they do about the average form of oppression they are carrying out. The oppression is done to invite MNCs in status quo. Secondly, we would just note that even if the direct up-top regime doesn't care about this, they're often supported by oligarchs who really rely on this money. These are people who often have long-term contracts and investments within multinationals. They've often said we'll get a 20% cut of your profit if we continue to let you operate without any form of harm in these countries. Notably, this just does mean that outside of the house, oligarchs are uniquely influenced and they often carry significant amounts of power onto these economies, which is why we think you're likely to trigger change. We would note that MNCs are directly complicit and actively empower this type of activity in status quo. I want to be extremely explicit here. In status quo, the incentive of MNCs is to create a race to the bottom to decrease the cost of labor. They do this by bribing governments to allow them to carry out human rights abuses, allow them to continue to crack down on people so that their conditions look comparatively better. What changes on outside of the house when you're no longer able to implement this type of behavior because you know you'll be prohibited from entering these places in the first place? We think two specific things happen. First, the incentive of MNCs flip. Notably, these MNCs are the reason why you can often not enact change because they often contain a stronghold of the political regime of these economies. What this means is that instead of lobbying against human rights abuses, for human rights abuses, instead of bribing politicians to look the other way, the incentive of MNCs changes such that they no longer hold this stranglehold on checking for human rights violations within these countries. This means that it is just the case that we uniquely change the incentive calculus of MNCs, which often crack down on protesters, which often harm individuals on the ground when they're sat in the house, to actively protecting them within our world. We would just say they often raise significant amounts of awareness outside of the house. Notably, this is done at a large level. You literally tell tons of countries, we're going to conditionalize this and we're going to push reform. This means that it's often covered in large-scale media outlets. It's covered throughout the world, and it's often something that's incredibly important and becomes a large piece of news. Notably, this discourse means that the average person is just significantly more aware of this. To at the point where we literally say MNCs cannot. Notably, this means that Western empowerment, to the extent that like you don't buy from certain MNCs, to the extent that you don't trade with certain countries, to the extent that people talk to their lawmakers more about implementing sanctions in small regimes, becomes significantly more useful and outside the house, and local people care significantly more about these. There are responses from God that I want to deal with. First, I'm going to say that worse actors replace you. There are two responses that I want to just immediately make to this. Just know what are these worst actors? They have no money, even ever ground in its bubble, and it is over leveraged in status quo. It is unclear how much investment they can actively pour in. Secondly, Russia, the Ukraine war is literally happening, guys. I am unclear how you have billions of dollars spare on these economies. Given this, even if these countries do invest, we would posit that to the extent that they scale a benefit, the best is significantly larger in these countries, and at that point, we're likely to see a reduction in the fundamental status quo. Finally, I want to deal with the preempt the argument that this harms the average person on the ground. There are three specific things that I want to note here. Many of these jobs are extractive and exploitative. They're often mining and other types of jobs in status quo, which means that these are often done in terrible conditions. Secondly, often autocratic regimes at the point where they are funded tend to backslide more and more and continue raising oppression. Notably, the race to the bottom that I mechanize means that you often create worse conditions on an incentive and systemic level. Finally, I just want to note the investment did create real opportunities. The only risk often is that outside of the house, when you actively change the incentive, MNCs are still going to go back. Maybe there is a small short-term harm, but over the long term, we change these types of things. There are three impacts then that I want to note. First, this empowers social movements within local economies. Notably, this gives you an economic shift to use leverage against individual people on higher up, which means that you have significant power and provides individuals a good way to change this. Secondly, you put norms-based incentives. Thing, as country changes, going to the bottom and providing the cheapest labor is no longer sustainable on a systemic level. We think you're likely to create better norms around inviting countries in to creating a race to the top to making yourself more attractive for FDI. It's not the case that we don't solve for everything. We would just say that we simply increase conditions and make them better in status quo. So to the extent that that is true, even a steady improvement in conditions on outside of the house wins us the debate. Very proud to.
Okay. The order will probably be responding some to on case and then off case. Cool. Is anyone not ready? Great. A lot of Gov hinges on the ideas that these developing countries are no longer going to do stuff like human rights abuses because of fear of MNCs being kicked out. There are 5 reasons this is probably unlikely to be the case. 1, structural abuses probably aren't up to the individual decision-making of particular political individuals. That is, they're often the result of stuff like political movements that go out of control, racial hatred, and genocide that springs up across the country, stuff like political death campaigns, which is tied to the success and well-being of an entire political party, not just a single decision-making individual. The implication of this being that even if there is some incentive for some individuals to stop doing stuff like human rights abuses as a result of MNCs leaving, there's never one individual who gets to make this decision, which means the fact that these abuses are structural to begin with means that Gov literally has no solvency, because even if there's an incentive question, there's never a capacity layer that's adequately addressed. 2, I just think that likely people within these countries are often bought into human rights abuses on a political level because politicians will campaign on certain outcomes. This is why Trump can't stop kicking immigrants out of the country, even if, for example, Apple and Microsoft start leaving because of human rights abuses and detention camps at Gitmo. It's because he's built up the expectation among his voter base that he's going to be campaigning against these individuals. Similarly, like most war crimes are camouflaged as legitimate political acts and become incorporated into political promises. They're assimilated into the rhetorical and political system of these countries, which means that politicians can't just stop without betraying massive voter promises. And three, human rights abuses are often necessary for these regimes to exist to begin with because they're super regressive and inevitably cause backlash. Human rights abuses on a systemic level are therefore inevitable when people resist against them and are violently crushed. This is why someone like al-Bashar couldn't just stop doing human rights abuses at the threat of at the threat of companies withdrawing from his country, because it was often necessary to maintain the brutal grip on power that exists in these places to begin with. And four, I just think this gives these countries a greater incentive to hide human rights abuses. That is, they mechanize where these countries are often developing, and often there's a low degree of penetration when it comes to information and oversight from international countries, which means it's probably just relatively easy for these countries to do stuff like hide human rights abuses. And they always have an incentive to do so instead of stopping those abuses outright, insofar as it's much easier. It doesn't involve making as many political sacrifices. And note that these multinational corporations always have the incentive to collude with them on this question, because these multinational corporations only care about profiteering. Second overview on case is that oligarchs care, so they probably is against the argument that oligarchs care, so they pressure MNCs to do less human rights abuses. Two problems here. One, they never explain why oligarchs are tied to these countries to begin with, i.e., if you're a billionaire living in a country with a lot of political instability and MNCs are then banned from that country, you probably don't pressure those MNCs to come back. You probably just leave and follow them to Germany or Europe or whatever. And two, I think that oligarchs often have their pocket lined by the government. They always pressure the government to line their pockets, but it's unclear why they're going to pressure the MNCs, insofar as oligarchs always have relatively more power over the petty dictators in their backyard than they do multinational corporations, which means the nature of the pressure just shifts. Go to their arguments proper. The first argument they make is that MNCs are really important to local economies. We agree. We'll explain why this is really bad then to ban them. They say it gives military juntas lots of money and lots of taxes. I think the counterfactual then is these juntas still have a precarious grip on the country and still need a way of raising funds in the short term. This means they do a couple of things. One, they do more violent actions because they need to seize capital from stuff like rebel groups, or they need to crack down on certain areas. Two, they squeeze citizens more by making taxes higher. Or three, they just tax the shit out of domestic industries as opposed to taxing multinational corporations. Because it used to be you could just tax Apple at 1% tariff or something and then make billions of dollars. But now you have to massively make out for it for squeezing the domestic industry completely out of existence. And note that there's always a existential risk to the regime, because if they don't have money, they can't line the oligarchs' pockets per Gov's own framing, which means they always have a strong incentive to do stuff like squeeze domestic corporations in a world in which they can no longer make money for multinational corporations. They say that multinational corporations decrease the cost of labor and they bribe these countries to carry out human rights abuses. Four responses. One, there's always an incentive for governments to regulate because they don't want multinational corporations to come into the new country and run roughshod over their rule of law. Oftentimes they do stuff like regulate these countries as political talking points to prove to their base that they do in fact have rule of law down. Two, they have to compete with domestic industries and offer reasonable wages. So if Apple's coming in, it is competing to some extent against emerging domestic industries, which means this competition drives up wages in the marketplace naturally. Three, I think that like economic development, generally speaking, raises all boats. Even if there's some exploitation in the short run, getting massive amounts of capital and investment into these economies leads to more people have purchasing power in the long run, more consumer spending, and more economic development in the long run. And four, I think people opt in rationally, i.e., people only opt in to coercive and bad labor if the alternative is subsistence farming or starvation, which is obviously worse, which means at best they're proving there's exploitation, but they never prove the counterfactual is any way meaningfully better. They say that multinational corporations lobby against human rights abuses in their world. Two problems with this. One, they already do this to some extent, i.e., the incentives don't change here insofar as the countries in which they're doing business, which are committing human rights abuses, represent a relatively small number of countries they're doing business in. Their overall incentives to lobby for better labor standards are sort of exogenous to the question of what those individual countries are pushing for. Go to the off case. The first argument we're going to make is that multinational corporations are uniquely good for people on the ground. They mechanize why there's a massive degree of scale and investment in these areas. But why are multinational corporations much better than domestic industries in terms of investment? One is that they have a unique degree of capital and scale per the on case. Two, they can optimize for each point in the supply chain. So for example, if harvesting cacao beans in one place is really easy, but it's really hard to process them, if it's a multinational corporation, you do the harvesting and processing in two different companies. But if you're a state-run or a domestic corporation, you do it in the same place, which causes massive inefficiencies that result from a lack of economies of scale. Three, you often bring in large scales of foreign expertise, which allows you to automate the sort of labor chain and make things go much faster, produce goods at scale much faster. And four, you probably drive up tertiary investments in other parts of the economy for two reasons. A, there's more perceived stability in these countries because the fact that Apple or Microsoft is throwing in their lot with the long-term political stability of this country means that other investors are likely to do stuff like perceive the domestic industry as more stable and therefore more likely to invest. And B, there's a higher projected demand, i.e. the fact that large multinational corporations are moving in there means there's going to be a consumer base in the long term, which means there's always going to be an incentive for other investors to invest in domestic industries as well. Why then do these these multinational corporations care about long-term growth in these countries. One, they're doing infrastructure investments with long-term profit horizons, i.e., if their goal was just to come in and extract a bunch of stuff and leave, they wouldn't be doing large-scale infrastructure investments to begin with. But the fact that they're tangled up in these economies, political and economics, in these countries' political and economic systems, means that they want long-term returns. They're making massive investments. They can't just make all that profit back in the short term. They want a consumer base with money in their pockets to pay them back like a decade from now. And two, I think you want investments in other developing countries. So if I'm a multinational corporation and every single developing country I go into, their economy gets totally destroyed, then no other developing country ever wants to work with me. So I have an incentive to ensure that they at least benefit somewhat from this as well. Finally, I think multinational corporations improve labor standards. One, they compete in the international sphere, which means they're adherent to international labor standards. Otherwise, they risk losing contracts in other countries, which elevates the overall regulation space. And two, host governments want to hold the multinational companies accountable. It creates spillover via competition, where now workers have multiple companies to pick from, which means that those companies have an incentive to make better labor practices. The second argument is capital flight. Look, even if you buy none of what you just heard, we probably think it's the case that even if multinational corporations are bad for these economies now, causing them to all leave in mass is really bad and destroys the entire global economy. Why does banning these countries, MNCs from operating in these countries, cause massive capital flight? One, it creates a chilling effect, i.e., it creates the fear of future bans or regulation in these developing world. And two, it creates a perception of political independence from Western powers, which scares away Western investors from ever investing in these places. And three, it inherently creates market turbulence, because now you have massive players who are rapidly exiting certain market spaces, which increasingly drives up the unpredictability for investors. What are the impacts of this? First, it causes domestic industries to go out of business in the ensuing shock, because whereas big companies have large capital reserves and can weather economic downturns, domestic companies are often running on much lower profit margins and they just all go out of business, which means in the long run, even if they're right, it just destroys local businesses, and eventually MNCs re-enter without competition, do all the predatory practices that they're talking about, and the result is long-term bondage to these entities, which probably outweighs any of the short-term amelioration of human rights abuses. And two, I just think they do stuff like, for example, go into a large recession, because when the largest, for example, provider of jobs in your company now, or in your country now, has to leave as a result of human rights abuses in your country, this then just causes a massive recession. It means fewer people are employed, less is spent into the economy, and oftentimes, because these countries are very poor and they don't have the ability to do monetary or fiscal policy of their own, the governments cannot adapt to these, and because of the spillover effect, the contagion effect, the fact they're trading with other countries in the economic world, it means oftentimes this recession spreads to affect tons and tons and tons of industries. So for those reasons, we are very proud to oppose.
Okay, great. Starting in three, two, one. I want to point out an inherent tension in the op case that Andrew tries to run. That is, he implicitly concedes that this kind of regulation would cause devastating economic effects for the actual people on the ground, but then he says it would cause no amounts of change because dictators have no ability to control the kinds of policies that are being passed. There's a few intuitive responses here. Number one, it might be true that some regimes are calcified to the extent to which change is impossible. But obviously, I think the place where this motion most strongly applies are regimes where either human rights are likely to scale up or likely to backslide more in the future, in which case dictators have an incentive to not do these things if they know it's going to cause a domestic recession. But number two, I think this also applies very heavily to newer regimes that might be considering whether or not to verge into more autocratic or dictatorial norms. For instance, places like Turkey that know that if they do this, this would cause devastating effects to their economy. So there's a preemptive decision to not conduct human rights violations. Secondarily, I think Muzzy already clearly explained why these kinds of policies are announced beforehand and they have the ability to be removed after the fact. Given that obviously dictators are only able to maintain control over their country if there's a certain level of tacit acceptance from the average people on the ground and the oligarchs that Andrew concedes are so important to upholding the legitimacy of their regime, it is not clear to me why they wouldn't do things like go to the negotiation table with the West to figure out how to reform their human rights violations, take the necessary measures to be able to do so. Finally, then, Andrew's like, oh, a lot of the times these things are impossible to correct and therefore there is literally no recourse. But like, Obviously, if the incentive to pass these policies is to enact concrete change on the ground, it is not clear to me why the kinds of demands that they would be making would be impossible for someone to enforce. I think it is quite obvious that in many instances, the conditionalized ways that these policies would be passed would be to say that if you're able to reduce violence by X%, then we would allow the MNCs to go back in. Or for instance, if you stop genociding a certain number of people by sending your actual armed forces into these areas, we will allow the MNCs to go back in. Or if you stop, for instance, economically subjugating a certain number of people through the actual policies you're passing, then we're allowing the MNCs to go back in. I don't think in any world we're saying you have to stop racism or stop prejudice, but in fact, it's just talking about the literal policy and the literal actions that the governments are taking that constitute human rights violations in many instances. Then, the first thing they talk about is how this is very unlikely because these regimes are often calcified into doing structural abuses. A few responses here. Number one, I just do think their exact argumentation about why these regimes are likely autocratic and dictatorial means that they're very often centralized. So to the extent to which this is a small number of people controlling a vast amount of the policy and the things that happen in these countries, I actually do think that they have the power to create wide swaths of change that stop human rights violations from happening precisely because they are quite centralized. Number two, they explain why very oftentimes these regimes are calcified and legitimated by human rights abuses, so it's very hard to change the narrative. A few responses. Number one, I actually think this makes it a lot easier for you to do so because obviously a dictator, it's difficult for a dictator to organically say that they want to create change because obviously that is quite antithetical to their messaging before. But when MNCs go in and when Western nations say that we are literally stopping companies from operating in your country, it becomes a very convenient excuse for these leaders to say, I am reforming because I have to. It is the West that is making me do so, but I have no other choice than to stop some degree of human rights abuses rather than the action being directly attributed to their incentives, which makes it easier for their electorate to understand why these reforms had to be made, even if they're somewhat unpopular. But thirdly, I think obviously political narratives are quite manipulable, right? Like if it is true that these leaders are people who are quite charismatic, people like, I guess, Donald Trump, who have a cult of personality, it is not clear to me why they wouldn't be able to message these things like, hey, I am the good guy. I am like, I don't know, taking the higher moral stand and stopping these human rights violations for X or Y reason to actually help the economic standing of this country. But fourthly, they explain why, oh, this has an incentive for you to hide human rights violations a lot more. I think we can flip this argument. Muzzy already explains to you why MNCs in the status quo actually have an incentive to help these countries cover up human rights violations because obviously it benefits them from being able to operate in these countries. But given that this becomes a global standard, I think this actually increases the kind of oversight and reporting that can engage in these countries. The reason for this is, obviously, if these organizations want to have an accurate and correct bright line for when human rights violations are happening or not happening, I think they have an incentive, for instance, to enter into local industries and do more regular auditing, do more regular reporting, foster more two-way communication. And I think that, like, if it is true that they have an incentive to hide human rights violations, this is obviously symmetric on both sides of the house. But the fact that Amnesty International and the UN Human Rights organization have a clear ability to tell when human rights violations are happening because it's not that easy to hide means that this is just like not an argument that functions on their side of the house. Next, they explain that oligarchs are often tied to their country and they have power over petty dictators. Yes, that is our argument. That is precisely why, even if it is the case that average people on the ground do not have the ability to leverage and bargain with the political leaders, the oligarchs that face very real ramifications do. I do not think that Andrew's argument that they can just leave easily stands. And the reason for this is, very oftentimes their profit are tied to the natural economy and the natural resources in that specific nation. They rely on MNCs to do things like production, manufacturing, and distribution of that wealth itself. It is not the case that people can just take all of their assets and flee the country, right? And the reason for this is they obviously have established infrastructures and established economic systems within the country themselves. So when MNCs pulling out threatens a majority of the wealth that the oligarchs have, obviously the close connection of obviously the close political connections that the oligarch or the leader of the countries depend on pressuring them is the actual valve to create actual change. Then they're like, oh, this creates a lot more violence because you tax people a lot more. But like, guys, if it is the case that MNCs pull out and your way to collect tax revenue is by crushing domestic industry and taxing your domestic populace to the extent to which they have literally no money, right? And you're destroying nascent industries, it is entirely unclear to me why, number one, this does not lead to massive amounts of popular upcry, which is probably a good thing in repressive regimes. And number two, why this doesn't mean that domestic industries and the people who lead these industries also revolt against you. Like, you cannot have it both ways, that the leader can do whatever they want, but that they also do the exact kind of actions that make them so domestically unpopular that they have a legitimate chance to be overthrown. Obviously, the leaders want to avoid these outcomes, which is the reason why they have an incentive to make incremental change. Then, Andrew gives a bunch of arguments on the off case why this is good for people on the ground and why capital flight sucks. Like, yes, this is the argument we're making, right? The effects of these policies are so devastating that very oftentimes political leaders do not have the incentive to weather the storm and allow their countries to sink into an actual recession. And the intuitive reason for this is that the populace of a country might be able to accept some amounts of human rights abuses or some amounts of, like, I don't know, like repression, if that harm is not internalized. Like, that's the reason why ethnic genocide is so often accepted, because the majoritarian ethnic groups do not actually internalize the harms of other people being killed. But obviously, recessions do not discriminate from person to person, which is the reason why oligarchs, right, local businesses, and the majoritarian ethnic groups alike would all dislike this outcome from happening, which is the reason why this specific policy, more than blanket condemnations, more than blanket negotiations, are incredibly effective. And Andrew's argument is like, oh, then you can devastate these economies and the MNCs go back in. If this policy were to stand, it is entirely unclear to me why this happens. In fact, I think the scalar argument works towards our benefits. That is, the worse that the recession gets and the worse that the capital flight gets, the more incentive the dictator has, or like the country has, to enact change. And they might say, oh, the country becomes more isolationist. Entirely unclear to me how this happens, given that, number one, capital is limited. Number two, these local industries do not have the capacity to be entirely self-sustaining, especially if it is true that they depend on the MNCs in the first place. The bottom line of our argument then is that we can accept the premise that this is very bad for the countries and then explain why this is actually uniquely the reason why the countries would enact reform in the status quo. Very proud.
Okay. Is everyone good? Great. The first question is, can they just take them off and put them back on when they need to? The problem they're missing is that even if countries have the incentive to do so, MNCs don't have the incentive to go back into the same countries that previously did abuses. There's a couple of reasons why. One, they have low expectations of change. They have dealt with these governments for years. They are often very capricious governments. They're often very unreliable governments. So MNCs aren't going to want to go back into those governments once they even solve their abuses, because they don't expect that those governments will be able to solve those abuses. So they will just go elsewhere. And secondly, there are tons of other markets. There are plenty of poor countries in the world where you can underpay your workers that don't require ones with active human rights violations happening, which means that even if governments could theoretically have an incentive to reform the practices to get MNCs back, if those MNCs aren't likely to come back anyway, that incentive goes away. That demand side constraint is completely missing from their argument. It means that even if the governments wanted to change, they actually just can't. But on the question of how governments change, their argument basically is, well, governments have to change because they want the MNCs to be able to get money. What is a lot easier for governments to do than that? Well, they do a couple of things. One, they will massively scapegoat the entities that put these constraints onto them. They will say the UN is Western controlled. The UN is trying to impose these bad things onto us. They're trying to rig the global economy so that Westerners can only go to the West. And here's the thing, even if it is the case that they have to undergo economic hardship as a result, which is their argument, it doesn't matter because people will rally around the flag, which is the reason why systematically sanctions against Iran, Venezuela, etc., which devastated those economies far more than any international leaving ever could, have led to more support and not less support for the regime. Because people on the ground, yes, they do care about their own bottom line, but they also care about the self-respect and esteem of their country. And if they believe that their country is being constrained by evil Western actors, they will back the government more. And the added benefit of a government is that when people are poor all around, it means they're less and not more likely to revolt. It means that they're less likely to have the ability to drive a car, to actually go to the central city and protest the government. It means they're more focused on their immediate assistance rather than actually going to protest, because that means they don't have to have the ability to work the job that day. So governments just have an incredible solution to all of this, which is to say, the West is evil. They're trying to rig the global economy against us. Everyone get behind us. And historically, that has worked. Which is why the MG and the PMC are completely lacking in literally any empirical backing for literally any of their arguments ever, which is why they're wrong on this question. And secondly, is that even if governments try to do this, hardliners within those countries would either coup those governments or get incredibly upset. The empty argument is, the government can say this was force. Guys, that is literally politicians saying we are surrendering our sovereignty to a foreign entity, which is the easiest thing for any right-wing populist to ever want to campaign on ever, meaning that it's one, much more likely they elect people who are radical populists as a result, meaning there's more protectionism and the country gets overall poor in the longer run. Two, more likely of coups from people who think that the government is ceding to foreign actors, meaning it's more likely to get civil wars and long run states collapse. And thirdly, they don't solve any of their offense because governments are forced to be pressured by hardliners, which don't allow them to do these kinds of reforms in the first place. But even if all of that wasn't true, they just don't trust the UN fundamentally as an entity. There's a couple of reasons why. One, they think they are largely controlled by Western actors. And they're not entirely wrong in this, like the way the UN Security Council work, the way that a lot of voting chairs and things like the IMF work, do actually systematically advantage Western countries. So they think there's actually just no reason for them to be able to ever win in these kind of settings. So even if they did solve their abuses, they just think the countries, the UN wouldn't care. B, they think that it's actually a malicious ploy by the West to make the West richer and the global South poor. And they're going to be reinforcements belief of countries like Russia, China, and Iran, which tell them they are right to do so and give them added money because they are doing so in the first place, which means it's far more likely in the vast supermajority of cases, the countries just double down on their bad practices, which means the PMC is dead in the water. And at that point, what offense is activated for us? The only response to the counterfactual of they will just cripple the domestic industries is, well, that means there's more outcry. They concede the link to this argument, which is absolutely abominable for them in this debate. And there's a couple of reasons why. One, domestic authoritarian countries getting poorer overall and not having the money overall because they have to tax them in this industry, the economy goes down. It's actually a very bad thing. It massively increases the risk of coups because any elite who is dissatisfied because their industry is getting taxed wants to replace the government. But coups are not a good thing, guys. Coups mean that governments are far more likely to be unstable in the longer run. They mean that capital all funds the country because you don't even know which actor you're dealing with in the first place. It means that military factions back one party or the other, making it far more likely to get things like civil war, which actually kill millions of people. This is systematically far more likely than the ability of like a democratic movement to actually happen for a couple of reasons. One, there's massive mistrust. Every citizen does not trust every other citizen because they all live under an authoritarian state, meaning it's far more likely they don't want to have the ability to make massive social organization, meaning the only people who actually can replace the government are established elites with their own private militias. And secondly, there's no road networks in a lot of these countries. Like the ability to overthrow the DRC government, for example, if you live in Lubumbashi, is legitimately impossible. Whereas elites do have the ability with private jets, etc., to access and use private capital to actually overthrow governments. And coups just outweigh and flip the entire other case. Secondly, they use the stick far more than the carrot when they're dealing with domestic insurgencies or movements. The reason why is very simple. Autocrats would rather just not have to kill people overall. It means it's bad for them, it's not a good look. It often creates significant costs for the military. So they would rather be able to just buy people off. But if they can't buy people off because they have less money overall, it means they are forced to turn to the military to repress people more actively. And here's the reason why they're lacking the comparative, which is the military is going to get funded on both sides of the house. The first entity the government will fund on either side of the house is the military. And even if they have to get somewhat less money overall, they will still have enough money to fund the military through things like domestic taxation of domestic companies. So what ends up happening is on both sides they could oppress. On either side they have the option of using care, which they'd rather use. On this side they only use the stick. And there's far more violence and far more human rights abuses, which overall happen from governments. The last problem on the top level of their case is a principal Asian problem which they just do not solve. The response is, authoritarian means centralized. No, totalitarian means centralized. The vast majority of authoritarian countries are actually incredibly weak and pathetic states. They have relatively rich central governments, but they don't have the ability to control a lot of their own state. That is literally describing like 3/4 of Africa at this point. And these states actually just do have massive principal Asian problems they cannot solve. So even if the government wanted to do all these solutions, they literally can't because the places where the human rights abuses are happening are literally thousands of miles of fields. And if they try to combat on them, the military will be like, why are you claiming down our ability to fight back? Meaning they get cooed, which flips their case again. On the question of whether oligarchs sort of improve or whether they can leave the country or not, I think this is just actually missing the debate. Oligarchs are usually actually more tied to the domestic industries than to the multinationals. The reason why it's very simple, you're much more likely to be able to, as an oligarch, to extract money from the domestic cocoa board than to extract money from Apple. So the oligarchs are actually just perfectly fine with this happening because they think they can run their domestic systems more efficiently and that they don't have the competition from multinationals in the first place. On the claim about they say they try to preempt Russia and China with, I think, a pretty silly preempt. That's like Russia and China have no money. There's three responses to this claim. One, they get money from doing so. Like in Burkina Faso, they get Russia has done tons of money from gold mines they've controlled. So they actually, if they have no money, it's a reason why they would do this investment. And secondly, there's a much smaller amount of capital needed. Even if Russia and China are not that rich overall, the amount of money you need to go far in Burkina Faso is far less than it is in Russia or China. And thirdly, there's sometimes national security considerations that matter a lot more than the immediate cost of an economy. So why do they make active investment Russia and China more likely? A couple of specific reasons. One, Russia and China want to be seen as opposing the global West world order. So when this kind of dual happens, it is an active reason for Russia and China to say, we are supporting you against that world order. And secondly, it's a capital trade-off. Russia and China would always rather find where the money is needed. And if these countries are places where multinationals have fled, that's where the money was likely to go. They're not going to spend it there otherwise. Russia and China financing countries is strictly worse for a couple of reasons. One, it means there's no demands at all. Multinationals simply have some cosmetic demands they have to deal with in terms of human rights. Russia and China just actively do not. And secondly, there is no spillover to the populace whatsoever. It literally just goes straight into the oligarch pockets, and literally none of it diffuses out to the people, which is strictly worse for all of their very own arguments. They say multinationals are actually resistant and bad for change. Several responses. One, actually, that's not true. The reason why is because there's often protectionist impulses in the country. I mean, the multinationals have to seem better than the comparative to get workers to actually go to them in the first place. Secondly, Western consumers solve this. They want things like assurances that it's fair trade or good cocoa. I mean, it's likely to have more reforms. And thirdly, they still get profit even if they don't commit human rights abuses because it's still cheaper labor, even if you don't actively abuse the workers you're dealing with. That's just strictly better for them because they deal with the public relations outcry of committing human rights abuses. They say social movements get more power. Two flips of this argument. One is that individuals don't like social movements anymore. And the reason why is very simple. They think social movements are trying to get the multinationals which employ them out of their fucking country. So they're more likely to back repression against social movements because social movements are seen as a tool of the West to infiltrate them. And secondly, social movements get co-opted by political movements because the opposition party in any given place wants to use the fact of human rights abuses to punish the domestic government economically, which means people don't believe in social movements anymore because they think that just an agents of the West or agents of an opposition political party, and they mostly support repression against them, flipping the rest of their offense. Very proud to oppose.
Okay. My leg fell asleep. Is anyone not ready? Cool. Two ballots with substantial weighing. The first ballot is on capital flight. MG just concedes that there's going to be a massive amount of investment flight from countries in which these companies are banned. There's a number of reasons present in LOC. A, this creates a chilling effect, aka the PMC literally gives you this mechanism on a silver platter. If Egypt, as a result of its own human rights abuses, starts kicking out multinational corporations, then obviously investors are no longer going to invest in Egypt or any sort of Egyptian domestic industry because they're massively afraid of future government crackdowns, even outside the realm of human rights abuses. Two, they can see this massively drives up instability in these regions writ large, because now you have massive fiscal players entering and leaving the market when otherwise they wouldn't. The implication of this being that investors just prefer to invest in other places and not these countries instead. The result of this is that multinational corporations leave en route, investors pull out lots of investment en route, and it massively causes a global recession. For all of the conceded arguments from LSE about why these countries are all very entangled in the global supply chain, that is, oftentimes we rely on them for stuff like, for example, cheap labor to produce goods at scale, which means that any sort of marginal shift in one part of the supply chain has cascading effects down the entire supply chain and affects literally billions of people. The only response we get from the MG is just like weigh human rights abuses above this and say that governments changing their incentive profile on committing human rights abuses matters more than a global recession. LOR is just going to bite the bullet and explain why preventing a global recession matters more than their best case scenario, which is marginally fewer human rights abuses. Three pieces of weighing here. First, on a question of scope, note that this is not a question of just these countries as it is on their side of the house, but every other country that trades and does business with them per the supply chain warranting ahead. This means literally billions of people are affected, and it affects their ability to feed their children, to live in safe places, to get a job, which has a compounding effect throughout generations. The implication being that billions of people are affected to a substantial degree, and this effect ripples throughout time. The second reason is then starvation. We've all heard the generic warrant, but it's true. Famine kills more people than bullets. The fact is, more people are structurally dependent on the economic system than they are structurally dependent on the lack of human rights abuses in their political system. The implication of this being that when the economic system suffers, millions of people now starve, which is a much more acute human rights abuse on the consequential level than anything they defend ameliorating. And third and finally, we are the necessary prerequisite for reducing all of their arguments. The LOC line is very simple. Governments don't just commit human rights abuses in a vacuum. They do so because they're often desperate and they need so to preserve their political power as a regime. The implication of this then is that when they are more desperate, when they have less money, when they must squeeze domestic industries more, when there is more political unrest per the MO, all of this increases the the incentives of these countries to engage in human rights abuses to begin with. So maybe they're right, and in the short term, in the 5 to 10 years, we create a better global order and we make these countries massively less likely to commit human rights abuses. The ensuing economic turmoil and all the defense in the MO explains why this is really, really bad for these countries in the long term, and the weighing I just did explains why this causes, on scope, more human rights abuses in the long term. The second argument we're going to make is that the existence of this policy deters MNCs from ever entering or growing these economies to begin with. They say, you can just make changes so that MNCs no longer have to leave. But Ole explains why even having to make these changes to begin with makes your labor market relatively less competitive of an investment climate than every other developing country out there. The implication of this being that the developing countries which are committing human rights abuses, which are the ones per LOC that are often the poorest and the most desperate and have the most least well-off individuals in the round, are also those individuals who are now structurally cut off from any sort of foreign investment because their economies are viewed as relatively more unstable than other developing economies. Their argument is, but domestic industries develop instead. But they miss the sequencing argument in LOC that wrecks all of Gov, which is just, guys, domestic industries need money to develop. And the reason why investors are willing to move into developing countries to begin with is because of the presence of companies like Apple, because of the presence of companies like Microsoft. It's because of the presence of these multinational corporate companies that drive up the perceived stability of these investment climates. The implication of this then is that when there are generically fewer MNCs who are willing to enter these countries to begin with, there's less investment in domestic industries as well, which triggers all of their arguments about why there's worse labor conditions, why wages are lower, and why exploitation is higher, and it ensures that the developing world is always developing and never developed. For these reasons, we are proud to oppose.
Cool. Can I be heard?
Yep. But I can't hear you anymore.
Yeah, I'm not sorry. I'm just 3, 2. The problem with the ballot on capital flight is that it has a massive tension built with MO and LOR. If you can move to tons of other poor countries, I am unclear why this recession happens, given that by MO and LOR's own mechanisms, you will just move to Colombia from the Philippines. It's unclear then that you're going to get the massive global recession that they are talking about because you just move your fucking supply chain preemptively as they themselves claim. At that point, the entirety of that ballot is short-circuited. But I also just want to note the silliness of
Point
this
of order.
argument. Yeah.
The claim here is that if you can move a supply chain to a different country, that you stop a recession in the first country. I think that's a new argument.
No. So that's not the argument I'm making. I'm just saying that, like, you guys are saying that there's a global recession because all supply chains are collapsed. I'm just saying that MO says you can move the supply chain. So, yeah.
I didn't think that was the nature of the. I also don't think that's what the op says. I don't think the op says you can move supply chains. I think the op says you can invest elsewhere, but I think that's a different argument. So either way, I think it's new.
Sure. Secondly, and this is really, really important, maybe some countries don't care if there is a global recession, but the vast majority do. And this is what we told you. The issue is that many countries preemptively don't want the recession to happen and have the ability to conduct concrete changes. They do not want the economy to fail. And obviously, by the way, these countries where this does happen are incredibly small, given that the MONR themselves explain Burkina Faso has very limited money. To the extent that that is true, these are also places where minority groups do not receive economic benefits and resources. Most of the money goes to oligarchs, and at best, they comprise a small amount of the global supply chain. Their ballot on global economies makes literally no sense. The ballot then that I want to do is just on norms. Extremely explicit here. Both sides have arguments on why really calcified countries could do very bad things on either side of the house. The issue is that this is not where the vast majority of the debate is, because obviously these countries may or may not change their incentives on either side. The question is whether we can create a global world order where in the future countries don't evolve to wanting to change within this specific way. Here is what we told you. When you see that these countries are isolated, when you see that Iran is no longer getting any money and is actively really, really poor, when you see that other countries are not going to have any investment go to you, preemptively, MNCs and others leave when you start getting authoritarian. It is just true that when you start saying, I am going to be a right-wing populist, I am going to start engaging in human rights abuses, tons of people from your base say, fuck no, because we're going to lose the 20 MNCs that support us. Your oligarchs check their base, and everyone engages in that. Notably, this is prior to any genocide. This is prior to using any form of propaganda. So every future country that was going to become authoritarian actively lowers the threshold here. The weighing on this is threefold. One, we see this already happening in a ton of other countries. Turkey, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Colombia, places where this exists. Secondly, this is a larger set of the pie than anything they have because it curtails all future abuses. Maybe current abuses remain symmetric, but the future abuse reduces on our side of the house. Thirdly, it just limits the population of these regimes in the future, right? So to the extent that more humans are created in the future, to the extent that there are more people that are born in the long term, we would say that these matter significantly more than the small number of people that they control on their side of the house, which is the 5% of regimes that are authoritarian. We impact the 50% that may or may not choose to implement these policies on their side of the house. So that is the first and easiest ballot where you can vote for Gov on our side of the house. Second ballot is on why it's likely the case that you're going to actively form these changes. Here's what they tell. They say, guys, trust us. The problem is that these countries and MNCs are going to want to implement good policies and they're never going to go back in. The reason MNCs continue to stay within these economies in most cases is because they have some degree of capital investment. So it's not feasible for them to just say, I'm going to move out tomorrow. Why is it likely then that governments actually change their policy within the year that they are there? Very simple. They themselves tell you popular outcries happen, coups happen. And you know what a dictator doesn't want? A popular uprising or a coup, like mentions themselves. So the weighing is incredibly simple. They often cooperate and work with the West on our side of the house to a very large extent. Their response is, but guys, ideological things exist. These ideological countries are not where most change is happening. Most dictatorships are in fact based on personal benefits because we would posit that the people controlling the dictatorship are often elites who are educated in the West. They are people who don't necessarily believe in ideology as we explained because it's just they were raised in a completely different way. They were the ones who spread that propaganda. To the extent that that is true, they can often change their propaganda machines to work more with the West and our side of the house. Their response is other groups will do worse things. But we are fine with that. Because even if there is popular outcry, overthrowing the authoritarian regime just does mean that you're likely to get more change. Why then is it the case that MNCs are likely to do better on our side of the house and fund better? Two things. One, obviously, local governments are trusted by the West. The reason for this is really, really simple. You have Western media, you have Western people who are giving you aid, NGOs, USA, tons of other things, which matter way more than the small ideological scapegoating that they talk about. But also Helen's argument. The majoritarian group is now affected. When the MNC leaves, it is your local base that doesn't have a job, and they care more about that than the small rally the flag effect. Given this, one, either a popular outcry and uprising happens, in which case authoritarian regimes are overthrown, and the West often helps rebuild. Or two, the MNC reinvests and changes and reforms the country. Countries tend to improve their labor standards. And even if this is not the most massive improvement, we get some amount of change on our side of the house. Very proud to propose.